Hey everyone, let's do some quick learning about amphetamines. These are a type of medication known as psychomotor stimulants in that they stimulate brain activity and motor activity. These drugs can also be referred to as sympathomimetic in that they mimic the sympathetic nervous system and its typical activities. I just want to take a note and say that amphetamines in the drug addiction or substance use disorder world are generally lumped in with freebase amphetamines, which include your methamphetamines. However, amphetamines, like we'll learn about today, prescribed medications, absolutely have the ability to create a dependence. They are misused, they are diverted, they hold all types of those possibilities, and they're very, very frequently prescribed. So they do fall under that realm of psychomotor stimulant medications that also can cause dependence. When we think about the origins of amphetamine, there's definitely a tendency for individuals to believe that this is something truly lab created. However, it is something that definitely has botanical origins. So in ancient Chinese medicine, there's been knowledge and use of this ma huang plant for quite some time. And this is a plant from which we have synthesized or isolated ephedrine. So before ephedrine came to the market, individuals were just ingesting the ma huang plant, and it was an arm of one of the treatments used in ancient Chinese medicine. Before any ephedrine use, what Park Davis had on the market was adrenaline. And you might notice if you look there, the adrenaline name, which looks annoying, adrenaline, it's missing an E. That is something that was trademarked by the Park Davis company. So one of the main reasons we call epinephrine is because Park Davis had trademarked the adrenaline name. So therefore, the actual name of, adrenaline wasn't used anymore. So that's fun trademark law. But anyways, we had this adrenaline, which was sold in ampules so that people could break an ampule open and take it. And it was really important in the treatment of anaphylactic reactions. It mainly had peripheral nervous system effects, so it was used for its pressor-like capabilities. And then from the ma huang plant, ephedrine was isolated, and ephedrine became the most popular thing that could be used because it didn't have to be from an ampule, it didn't have to be injected or taken in any other weird type of way. It could be taken orally or as something used intranasally. So ephedrine was really helpful and really cornered the market as a decongestant. Eli Lilly was who sold that. They're still around today. And the competing pharmaceutical companies wanted an alternative. Another company developed then, based upon the structure of ephedrine, they developed the lab-created amphetamine. So we would say that amphetamine is based upon the ma huang plant derivative of ephedrine, and ephedrine took the place of adrenaline. Just a couple more notes about some historical use of amphetamines throughout society. Another drug company that's been around for quite a while now, I think they're called GlaxoSmithKline. One of their original brotherhood names was the SmithKline and French pharmaceutical company. And they started selling a freebase form as a decongestant and as a bronchodilator in its way of working as a sympathomimetic. Freebase means that you free the drug from its water base that can typically allow things to be smoked. So that means at this point in time, this is the first use of methamphetamine. And methamphetamine was, again, just created by a pharmaceutical company so that you didn't get a stuffy nose and you could reverse bronchospasm. Hooray. But it was immediately noticed that when you gave people methamphetamine, there was a huge amount of psychostimulation. And when you're taking things, especially by an oral route, you're not getting the psychosis and impulsivity that you might see with a really large dose. So they found that this works as just what it's supposed to. It's a psychomotor stimulant. It increases somebody's ability to think, making critical decisions, making fast decisions, and it makes you move a lot faster and effectively. And you also do not have the ability to get really sleepy. It was really instrumental in World War II, especially around Germany's armies who gave methamphetamine doses to their soldiers each day, and that played a very large role in the Blitzkrieg. If you're interested in that type of history, highly recommend you check out Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich. Excellent book that looks at the role of methamphetamine in World War II. Following its importance in the role of World War II, it continued to be very popular, especially among soldiers who returned home from war who had been given methamphetamine every day and now had to deal with life without it. It was legal, so it was very widely distributed. You could buy it in stores, and to go along with making money, one of the companies decided to make an injectable form. That was when things really took a turn for bad. We could no longer trust companies to make things that were safe and then people to be safe with things that they really wanted to take. So it was discontinued relatively quickly. So it has this really storied history. And to make things even more interesting is how popular amphetamines remain today. So here is a list of some graphs showing you the use of amphetamines in the United States in the past about decade. And we see that we still have high use among young kids, especially males, but use is going up in females and in adults. Amphetamines are approved to treat both narcolepsy and ADHD, and they are everywhere. So let's learn about them. One of the reasons that we prescribe them so heavily, as you just saw on the slide prior, is for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which needs to include 6 or more symptoms of inattention and then 6 or more of hyperactivity impulsivity. And there's other videos of mine where we can learn about ADHD, but ADHD is something that is more commonly diagnosed and earlier in its diagnosis than what we have ever seen, and the stimulant medications remain the standard of treatment. They remain the standard of treatment because they help. They're psychomotor stimulants. When people take psychomotor stimulants, they think more effectively. They are more in control of their motor movements, so you do not fuss or fiddle with things. You pay attention and you do what you're supposed to do. Stimulants improve behavior and learning in almost 80% of children who are correctly diagnosed. Almost everyone, 90% of kids who are diagnosed with ADHD, they get Ritalin, their methylphenidate. Only about 10 to 30% of ADHD individuals are treatment resistant, so they show either no or little response to treatment. And in those cases, you can move on to things like giving an antidepressant or using different behavioral interventions. Again, otherwise, stimulants remain the standard of care. So we have a couple of things. We've got our ADHD meds, so those will include our stimulants, methylphenidate, non-stimulants, alpha-2 medications. Today's not the day to talk about behavior, but there are behavioral modifications that involve things like token economy, frameworks for getting good behavior by rewarding good behavior, and individual and group counseling. Other things you have to keep in mind for management, that impulsive behavior, so impulsive decision making or impulsive motor activity, is really a hallmark symptom of ADHD. Regardless of if these are humans or animals, amphetamine lowers impulsive responding. So amphetamines are really helpful in lowering impulsive activity. That can be like yelling out in class or doing things that are, you're not supposed to do. There's also hyper-emotionality and mood lability, lots of changes in mood. So this, because of the interplay with the impulsivity system and our emotional system, we can reduce impulsive emotional responses by either adding other medications or using these stimulants. And then you have to keep in mind that people with ADHD quite often have sleep disruption. So we have to make sure we're giving individuals medications that don't work too long, that are out of their system by the time they need to go to sleep, that they're still getting refreshing sleep, and we're not interfering with their cycling in any way. All right, if you're in the United States, you are likely familiar with methylphenidate. Methylphenidate, or your Ritalin. So this is marketed as the non-addictive substitute for amphetamines. It is similar in its structure to amphetamines, but it is not truly of that class, in that it does not have the exact same mechanism of action as an amphetamine, and that's very apparent in its pharmacokinetics. So Ritalin, especially if you're living in New York State, it is really difficult to get approved by an insurance company to give anything without trialing Ritalin first, meaning the insurance is like, try Ritalin. If that doesn't work, then we'll discuss putting somebody on a more expensive medication. Ritalin is the OG med. It is the less stimulant variety, and there's so many different formulations of it. There's some that come on immediately, like they start working almost immediately, and they're relatively short acting. They last for a couple of hours. There's immediate onset, but then overall they act for a long time, many hours. There's delayed onset, long acting. So maybe they don't work for a few hours. They make a formulation now that you take the night before and it starts working in the morning. So it's very delayed. There's long-acting prodrug formulations. There's long-acting transdermal preparations. There are so many different ways to try methylphenidate. It is the least of the things with an addictive liability associated with it, and it's relatively cheap. And it has an immediate release, like, old school dosing regimen. So 6 mgs for kids is pretty stable of a starting dose. It's taken twice a day, and the first dose of the medication is taken before school with breakfast, and then at lunchtime the student visits the nurse, and that's when they take their second dose, because this med only has about a 2 to 4 hour half-life, and that means by the time they're leaving school for the day, it's about wearing off, and maybe you have a little bit left over in the circulation for homework. Adults typically take much higher doses, 10 to 15 mgs a day, or even 40 to 60 mgs per day, depending upon which preparation. Fun shout out for the United States. Number one, 90% of Ritalin in the States, or in the world, is consumed by the US. So United States on top, winning. Congrats. How does methylphenidate work? It has a relatively straightforward mechanism of action if you understand some neuropsych. So 2 things that bump around in the very front of your brain called the prefrontal cortex that help you feel awake and kind of okay with life and okay with stimuli, or your norepinephrine, so your noradrenaline, and your dopamine. If you have low levels of those things up in your prefrontal cortex, then you feel kind of tired. If you have too much, you feel, stressed physiologically, not necessarily just psychologically. That's like your heart rate is really high and you're, thinking about a million things at once. However, if you have a nice moderate level of both of those things at a set dose, perhaps like a set dose of a medication, you are alert and you are able to attend to something for a specified and even prolonged amount of time. So the way that methylphenidate promotes this is by interfering with what we call the reuptake. So the way that things work in your brain is, why would we make new neurotransmitter when we can just take the parts of the neurotransmitter that we already have and repackage them? So when we want to repackage new norepinephrine and new dopamine, we suck it back up into the neuron and we package it in vesicles. And the way that we suck it up is through a reuptake transporter. So DAT is dopamine transporter, NET is norepinephrine transporter, and pH is methylphenidate. Methylphenidate binds to the reuptake transporters for both norepinephrine and dopamine, meaning rather than being sucked up into the neuron for regifting and re-release, that is allowed to stay in the synapse, and then it acts longer so that we sustain attention longer, we sustain being alert. Holy moly, you can definitely pause the video here and take a good look at all of the different variations of, these are just methylphenidate formulations. That's how popular of a medication there is. There are plenty of different prescription varieties. You've got your prodrugs, you've got your patches here, you've got short acting, long acting. So if you want to take a little pause and view all the different choices available to you, go ahead, enjoy yourself. All right, next up, we've got another old school med, dextroamphetamine or d-Amphetamine, sometimes sold as Dexedrine. So d-Amphetamine, Dexedrine, dextrostat, this is the D-isomer of amphetamine, and it now is not the non-addictive, non-amphetamine form. This is the amphetamine. So this is plain old D-isomer amphetamine. This is approved for use in kids older than 6, and for adults, there are 5, 10, and 15 mg dose preparations available, either taken once a day or twice a day. And this is about a 10 to 12 hour half-life, which means if you're giving it to a child before school at 7 a.m., that means up until about dinner time, that drug is on board and in the system. By that time, it starts to wear off, which is good because that means it's dinner time and they're ready to eat. One thing that you will see with all amphetamines is that they do suppress appetite. Ideally, they're able to maintain some eating throughout the day. A lot of people report that the anorectic effects of the med go away after about 3 weeks of use. If not, at least the medication, when it wears off, the individual is usually hungry. So it wearing off by dinner time is good. So you want to make sure this is dosed as early in the day as possible to allow for that. But this has what we call homework coverage or after school coverage, where the Ritalin was just wearing off as kids get home from school, and then it might be difficult for them to pay attention and get their homework done, whereas this has pretty long coverage. So that's your d-Amphetamine. This has a clearance rate, so when you're clearing something, you're excreting it from the body. That is dependent upon having a nice acidic urine. So this is one of the things that is dependent upon pH for excretion. Okay, and then we've got the one that's been hot for a while, the mixed salts amphetamine, sometimes just called mixed amphetamine salts, meaning mixed as in D and L amphetamine, not just d-Amphetamine. This is sold as Adderall. Most people are familiar with this. There is an immediate form. There is an extended release form. It is available in many trade and generic formulations. Again, immediate release, extended release. The rule really with addictive liability is the faster something gets to the brain, the more rewarding it is, the more dopamine there is released. So if we can lengthen the amount of time for something to take before the brain feels it, the more space we put in between taking and brain time, the less liability for addiction there is. So that means that these immediate release formulations, those have a little bit of trouble around them, whereas the more extended release formulations don't carry the same connotations to it just because of the way things work. That also is why if we have a prodrug formulation where we have to wait even longer for the drug to go into onset mode, then theoretically, we're really reducing addictive liability. All right, so the half-life of your Adderall, 10 to 13 hours. Kids are really fast metabolizers relative to adults. Their livers are big, they are busy, their heart rates are high, and they metabolize faster. They also then are going to have altered peak plasma times because things are just like 1.25 the speed. So just know that they'll eliminate it faster. Adderall can be used in kids over 3. So as long as they are, well, technically 3 and over, they can take it for ADHD and for narcolepsy. If you are going with immediate release, 5 mgs is a good starting dose. Increase only as needed. It goes up quite high from there. For the extended release, depending on who you're treating, adolescents, 10 mgs a day, adults, 12, and then once you get to a rate where it's steady in the bloodstream and we can just maintain, usually people are maintaining with 20 to 30 mgs. All right, you've got the Hansel of the drugs now. This is so hot right now. It's been hot for a while. Your Lysdexamfetamine sold as Vyvanse. What makes this so hot right now? Well, the price. It makes people tons of money. But it is a prodrug for amphetamine, meaning that when you take Adderall, it's just Adderall, right? Like you absorb it and it just exists as Adderall and then the body starts to clear it. Here, this medication, you take it and once it gets to the liver, so after it goes through the whole absorption thing in the stomach, it will be converted into Adderall a couple hours later. It depends on what's in the stomach. So now it is 100% of the drug. None of it has been broken down. And it's going to last a lot longer. We've also put that space in there for the brain, making the brain less likely to find this as rewarding. But that also means that we're maintaining a really high dose, which the brain might like to begin with. It works really nicely. So this is an expensive med. There are doses available from 10 to 70 milligrams. Common starting dose is about 30. If somebody does have cardiac instability, there is a slight risk of sudden death. So we try to be careful with cardiovascular risk. Just recently, a generic form has become available, the Lysdexamfetamine. The way the FDA works is they want 15% pharmacokinetic profile matching to the original drug. It is within about 15%, but don't be surprised if you hear people say that their generic doesn't feel the same as the other one. They have some pharmacokinetic variants. Amphetamine is an interesting substance in that it really reverses and does weird things everywhere. Your 4 main actions that you can follow along with on the picture is first, this is a substrate. Your body believes that this is like norepinephrine. It sees it as that. So a lot of the places it binds, it's because the places in the body believe that this is your own norepi. Remember that adrenaline, which was similar to ephedrine? Amphetamine looks really similar. So it is able to bind to presynaptic norepinephrine and dopaminergic neurons and can dump dopamine and norepinephrine out, so it drives release. It drives vesicular docking and fusion. It also has activity where it can limit the the job of the monoamine oxidase enzyme, which would break down monoamines. So it can help limit that activity so that we just have our norepi and our dopamine around without breakdown. And then it does this really interesting thing where it actually converts the way, like how if something's clockwise or counterclockwise, it makes the DAT and the NET transporters run backwards. So rather than pumping things up into the cell, it actually dumps it out. It's like a vacuum blowing out instead of sucking up. So it really is able to completely flood the system with dopamine and norepinephrine. So you can see why this might be enjoyable. But remember, we're doing this at a dose where we're just getting this nice, steady level of these two neurotransmitters up in the prefrontal areas, hopefully, if everything goes great. Pharmacokinetics definitely is going to change based upon which dose there is. So how high of the dose, how you're giving it, the route of administration, but generally you're going to get psychomotor stimulation, which is not a bad thing. Like you've got more energy and you can think more efficiently. Once you get up to higher doses, that's when you can get a little shaky. People can get agitated. They feel like they have to move and they can't. Respiratory rate can change. And when people are on continual high doses, you see that they'll do repetitive activity like pulling hair or, I don't know, smacking your fingers, snapping your fingers, shaking your leg. But that can really progress into, more aggressive, delusional, and anorectic conditions. And it's solutes are detectable in urine for a couple of days after its use. Here's a list of all of the possible side effects of amphetamines. You can take a little pause if you want, but because it is sympathomimetic, it mimics sympathetic activity. So nothing here should be surprising because we are increasing sympathetic activity. Just some final things. So we talked about homework coverage a lot. So there's some schools of people who believe that ADHD is primarily a hyper-emotional response. It has to do with too much emotion and sleeping difficulties. So what that means with hyper-emotionality is that they feel a lot and they feel it a lot. So not only do you feel angry, but you feel extremely angry. You feel extremely sad. And it can be hard to regulate that. That is one of these regulatory components. So there's a medication on the market. It's called Guanfacine, and it's marketed for ADHD as Intuiv. But it is an alpha-2 agonist so that it would work to lower blood pressure. It does have a mechanism of action in the brain as well, which we'll see on the next slide, but it's a really useful treatment, especially for these later hours in the day. Let's say the kid's or person's medication is starting to wear off. You could either give an Adderall booster or you can try Guanfacine. So that's a non-stimulant. It lowers the blood pressure, lowers the heart rate, and that also does things like lower the rate of how wound up you have to be to go into panic or anger. There's relatively good titration with this, and people tolerate it really well, but it's a nice individualized approach to treatment of ADHD and most typically used as an adjunct. This is also really helpful if there's any motor tics. This is one of the drugs that can be used for Tourette's. In the family, Guanfacine is also of non-stimulants then to treat ADHD. So Guanfacine is here, and its brain activity, as I alluded to briefly, was up here on the NET. So in this case, they use noradrenaline. How old school. The norepinephrine transporter. So rather than having norepinephrine, noradrenaline sucked back up, we allow it to stay down here. So that would be its central effects, is that increases noradrenaline, and its peripheral effects are to lower BP. Then there is the final thing, Atomoxetine, that is your non-stimulant ADHD medication. That's your Concerta. And the way that this works, it's like an SNRI essentially. It is working to, it's a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So very similar to Guanfacine, atomoxetine works in this way, but it has none of the peripheral blood pressure lowering effects you would see with Guanfacine. And if you want to take a little pause here, these are all of the different medications that I just went through. So the last table was just methylphenidate. These ones, those are all of your stimulant medications. And that's what I have to teach all of you today. I would like you to leave this talk not only being smarter than you normally would, but one of the things I kept saying is that these are all psychomotor stimulants. They enhance your performance. So in the same way that there's performance-enhancing drugs for sports, these are performance-enhancing drugs for your brain. What if we consider doping illegal in the Olympics? What does that mean for performance of the cognitive sense enhancing drugs for things like the Nobel Prize or a chess competition? What did we think about that? I don't know, but since you're becoming so smart, I'd love you to think about it. All right, I hope you learned something today. I am glad you're here, and I hope you stay smart. Bye, everyone.